Look, I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. The education I got was very mediocre. Really not terrible, but not very good. I had to learn this shit on my own. I had to. Where else would I?
Not Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, I guess.
No. What was at Harvard and Yale were other young people to work with me on it, but I think I would have found them anywhere, at Caltech or at, I don't know, Illinois. What difference? There's always a few teachers. There's always a bunch of students. You find your way to them, by accident. Oh, you're interested. You're having a beer with somebody. Turns out they are interesting people and all that. That's all that happened to me. But, I had the pressure of my politics. I knew it's got to be better than this. This, as you grow up and you become an adult, this is it? No, you can do better than this. And that impulse made me learn this stuff. I used to get angry. I do remember sitting in a lecture hall at Harvard, but I remember it particularly, being so angry at the bullshit that was coming out of that teacher's mouth that I would literally, I was a good student, I'm a good boy. I sat through it all, took my notes, and then I ran to the library afterwards to refute it, because I didn't know enough to do it, but I knew where I would have to go. And I would sit in the library sometimes for hours, scouring an article or a book to find out some way to express my anger and upset at what this person had told me, including courses on Chinese and Indian history, which I took because I wanted to learn about other societies. My parents were immigrants, so, but they were Europeans, so that kind of. But, the world had fallen apart on them. So that's why they had to be refugees. It's a traumatic experience to be a migrant. Again, deporting them, so they have to be evil, empty vessels that nobody understands. But to be a migrant is a trauma. My mother was traumatized. My father was traumatized. They left their country, left their language, left their community, left their family, entered the United States, they didn't speak English. What a mess. All the normal turmoils and troubles of life are multiplied by the additional strains and pressure. They're very hard, and my father worked himself literally to death, died relatively early of a heart attack, because he worked too hard. Had a wife, 2 children, my sister and me. Hard to earn a living. He was a lawyer and a judge in Germany, my father. When I was born, he was pushing a wheelbarrow in Youngstown, Ohio, in a steel factory. So people have to understand that family that comes from Honduras, they were, raising bananas on a farm. Now they're working in Pittsburgh in a meat factory. Try to understand what these folks are going. No, deportable. So you grow up with. You also grew up with a concept. You're making me think. With a concept of difference. It's very hard for Americans. I spoke German at home mostly, and some French. Only when I was 5 years old, they dropped me into kindergarten. I learned English, I was born in Ohio, but I didn't speak English because, I'm a baby. I'm at home. Speak my mother and father language. My mother was German. She was the most important adult for me to deal with. So I spoke, I still speak German absolutely fluently because I did it the first 5 years. My French with my father I can do it. I can understand everything and I can make myself understood, but it's not fluent. It's labored. But here's what you get. Everything can be different. The English language is one thing, and the French and German are each of them separate from the other and separate from English. You understand everything could be different. It's hard to explain. Because you literally, if you're 11 years old, running around the playground with your friends talking English, except when you have to pee or you're thirsty, you run into your house and chit-chat with your mother in German, then you go back out. That trains you into the multiplicity of meanings, of intonations, of speech, and you appreciate difference. You're not frightened by it. You're not amazed by it. You assume it. And therefore, whenever anything happens, you naturally do what Hegel teaches you. The opposite. It's right in there. It's right there. It's not distant. It's not foreign. It's not a bad. It's right there. It's right there. Anyway.
I think since China seems to be the clear rival to the American hegemony we'll be discussing, it is worth revisiting this idea you mentioned but didn't follow up on, which is that Mao is in many ways responsible for the economic powerhouse that China has become. And what I was going to say is that as a verified non-expert in Chinese economics, my understanding is that China today represents this strange blend of capitalist, but also people and state-owned, state-intervening economics. So I'm wondering how that comes out of Mao, if I'm roughly correct in my assessment.
Well, it's a very long discussion, so I'm going to give you a very short answer.
Please.
All right. Mao's only friend in that long march, when he's making that long march, at that point, the revolution has already happened in Russia, 1917. Lenin has died in 1923. So what's going on in Russia in the second half of the 20s is a struggle between the two most important leaders of the communist movement in Russia after Lenin, because they're inheriting the situation. One is named Stalin, and the other one is named Trotsky. And depending on how you come down on these things, one is the hero, the other one is evil shithead, or vice versa. That's how that goes. The global communist movement splits on this subject. One side becomes the Trotskyist movement, the other is Stalinist movement. Stalin wins, Trotsky loses. First he's kicked out of the government, Trotsky. Then he's kicked out of the Communist Party. Then he's kicked out of Russia. He actually comes here to New York, spends a little time on the Lower East Side, moves to Mexico. And in Stalin, while he's in Mexico, he becomes very important to the Mexican communist movement, which was very strong then, but especially among artists. And they hosted him. Those artists included Frida Kahlo. You know who she is? See, again, Americans know all about Frida Kahlo, but that she was the hostess of Trotsky and probably slept with him more than a few times is a carefully cleansed to avoid any notion that, it's just, there are three great muralists, one of the greatest Mexico-produced muralist painters. People, paint the wall, the muralist. Diego Rivera, the husband of Frida Kahlo. David Siqueiros and Ortega. If you go to New School University, just a few blocks from here, there are murals up on the top of the building painted by Ortega. All over the Northeast here are painted by Diego Rivera, the Mexican. Rockefeller was one of his patrons. These are all communists. Siqueiros, Ortega, Diego, Kahlo, all communists, all Trotskyite friends of that. Stalin sent someone who killed him with an ice pick in his head.
Ice pick. I do remember that.
Very famous. So he's gone. Stalin takes over Russia, but Stalin and Russia help Mao. He's a communist. He's in China. It's a long shot. It's a few of them, hunted by the government army, but they got support. So they were very loyal to the Soviet communists, who kept helping them and helped them all through the Civil War. And one of the reasons Mao won the Civil War is he had some support from Russia, from communist Russia at that time. I don't want to take away. It was Mao's victory. He organized that army. There was a big army of Chinese people. They fought and they won. So in the early years, from 1949 to the end of the 50s, first 10 years, China is a very loyal ally of the Soviet Union, and these are the years of the Cold War. So the United States, allies already earlier with Chiang Kai-shek, tries to smash them. So the Mao and his people are very clear. The United States is not our friend. They tried to kill us, for Chiang Kai-shek. Now Chiang Kai-shek is sitting in Taiwan, twiddling his thumbs, and now the Soviet Union is our ally, but that makes us the enemy of the United States, and all of that. If you ever go back and you look at American history at that time, there was a tremendous hullabaloo about who lost China. And McCarthy, remember the McCarthy of the Senate, McCarthy? They went after a high-ranking State Department official named Harry Dexter White, one of the highest officials, would have become Secretary of State at one point. He was in line like that. But they hounded him out because they found him to have been, as a young man, he went to a Communist Party event or something. They had him. And so he sold out the United States, and that's why we lost China. The idea that the Chinese had something to do with this, Americans can't have it. It's all about us. Anyway, so Harry Dexter White was blown out over the water, and the Chinese became officially bad. However, by that time, the revolution, being grounded in agriculture, had undertaken a number of experiments unlike anything the Soviets had done. Mao felt it was necessary. One of them, toward the end of the 1950s, was the commune movement in China. And under Mao's inspiration, they formed commune. The word communism doesn't suggest something that you would set up communes in which people's relationship with one another is communal, not hierarchical. That's a long story of how they worked for several years. My master's thesis at Stanford is an analysis of the commune movement in China. That's what I did. Because I wanted to learn about it. This gave me the opportunity to learn. I wrote a senior thesis. At Harvard, if you got very good grades, you could sign up for either magna cum laude or summa cum laude. And if you signed up for either or both of them, you were relieved of taking courses in the last semester of your senior year, and instead you would write a paper, a major, and I did that. And there I studied the rise of Hitler. That was that's my family. I wanted to understand how did it come down on my mother and father to shake up their lives. By the time I was at Stanford, which was just a year later, I was on to studying China. And long story short, what Mao's experiments did was to freak the Russians out. And there began a tremendous, the German word, Spaltung, which comes from Freud. splitting took place. For some years, China and Russia denounced each other. They even had military skirmishes on the Chinese-Russian border, shooting at each other. It then died down, but it was a split that meant that the global communist movement also split. There were those who went with the Soviet Union, and there were those who split off and became known as Maoists. That didn't exist before. In the great revolutionary upsurges of 1968 in France, when Charles de Gaulle was driven out of, I don't know if you know, the students arose in France, reached out and said to the working class, join us in a revolution. In those days, the French Communist Party picked up 20% of the vote in every election. Very, very powerful. And the students went to the communist workers and the Trotskyite workers, who were also, and are still in France, important. And there was an alliance. And between the workers and the students, the chief of police of Paris went on the television and said to the government, if you come down on the students and workers, I can't be on your side, and neither will the police. De Gaulle got in an airplane, left France, went to an American air base in Germany to wait. I mean, that's how close it came. Though the leaders of that were not the conventional Communist Party, which was afraid of doing it, but the Maoists went. The Maoists took over. And because they did, Mao came into the consciousness of the French people, brought by this revolutionary thing. Well, who was impressed? Louis Althusser, my teacher. Jean-Paul Sartre, never the same after that. Foucault, never the same after that. I could go on. Jacques Lacan, all of them. Many of them were Maoists, young students caught up in it. And they then read Mao, and they thought Charles Bettelheim, I don't know if these names mean anything to you, the leading intellectuals all around the country. They then began to study Mao and to study what he had done. And they began to go to China to offer advice, to give them the benefit of what the West had taught Marxists. So this was invaluable. This was a way for a third world country to tap Western technology and thought in a way it could never happen any other way. But nobody understood that. They don't get it now either. But it transformed not just the consciousness of the West learning about Mao, but the Maoists learning what the West had to teach them about strategy. Long story short, they made a strategic decision, which I don't think could have been done without Mao. Even though this was done, Mao is dead or dying, so it comes with his end. And the strategic decision is, we're going to build a socialism different from the one in the Soviet Union. That comes out of their split with Russia. And we're going to make it different from what socialism has meant in the West. What did it mean in the West? Well, to this day, right, there are socialist parties in all the European countries. Many of them have been in the government. The Portuguese government, right now the Spanish government is the Socialist Party. Up until 3 months ago, the government of Germany was Schulz, the Socialist Party. Scandinavia used to be called Scandinavian Socialism. When Bernie Sanders explains what he means by socialism, he refers to Denmark. That's the socialism in which the government is very active, very regulatory, taxes a lot, and provides a shitload of public services, but leaves the private capitalist sector pretty much in private hands. Right? That's a kind of socialism. It's called socialism. Even here in America, people kind of, the post office is socialist. They understand the government does something, could be socialist. Stupid, but okay. Americans don't understand this stuff very well. The other sample is the Soviet Union, in which the government comes in and says, we're not going to simply tax. We're not going to simply regulate. We're going to take over. We're going to own and operate the enterprise as a state entity. Okay? Soviet Union did that with its entire industrial apparatus and with a good chunk of its agriculture too. Not all of it, but a good chunk. State farms, which are different from collective farms, those are private. By the way, what Americans don't understand that Russia never abolished private property, ever. It's always been an important part of their economy, always, and that the state was limited. But relative to anything in the West, the state is a very big player. China didn't do either one of those. China is unique because it's a hybrid. China is 50% state-owned and operated enterprises and 50%, not exactly 50, but roughly 50-50 private, all under the control of a powerful government, which is in turn under the control of the Communist Party. That's a unique structure. Russia didn't have that. Russia never allowed half of its industry to be private. And the Scandinavian socialists never allowed their socialism to include an immense governmental sector. In American mentality, it's large because relative to ours, it's bigger, but it was never very significant. That's why there have always been Swedish millionaires, billionaires, and all of that. They've allowed all of that. China now allows it also. The private sector includes Jack Ma and other big billionaires. But it's a unique model, not the Soviet. They broke from that. Mao broke from Russia in the late 50s, early 60s on these fundamental questions, opening that space. Other countries didn't do that. North Korea didn't do that. Cuba even didn't do it. Vietnam didn't do it. The Chinese did it. Now Vietnam does it, following the Chinese model, because China is so important and Russia has disappeared. Anyway, that answers your question.
We've spoken a lot today about China and the United States. Where does the collapse of Europe fit into perhaps the demise of the American empire, but also this transition away from capitalism?
Yeah, I think for me, partly as someone whose ancestors are largely European, here's the way it appears to me. I grew up in an environment in which history was presented in the following lopsided way. It kind of starts with Greece and Rome and then evolves into the modern period. And I've been regaled with the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, Athenian democracy, Roman slavery, the Middle Ages, the arrival of the big European states, the clashes that produced colonialism, in which Europe becomes the dominant power on the whole globe and carves up the whole globe among the European nations. That famous conference in Berlin in 1884, when they literally sat in front of a map of Africa and carved up Germany would get this and France would get that and Britain that. And then the explosions that we call World Wars I and II, which were mostly, not all, but mostly European events. Europe is the center. Europe is the dominant. Europe is where I look to learn about literature and science. And now Europe is becoming more and more an unimportant corner of the world. It is becoming what it used to look at the global south as, an unimportant little corner of the world, good for growing bananas or rubber plants or something else. Now Europe is itself becoming a small corner. The modern development of high technology, it's a non-European event. It happens in the United States, it happens in China. It doesn't happen anymore in Europe. The major industries that are growth industries are elsewhere. The industries of Europe are dying, are disappearing, are shrinking. There's a joke that England is on its way back to being what it once was, a cold, wet, offshore island of the continent of Europe. You know, haha, but there's wisdom and truth in all of that. The center of activity, the locus of growth, it's all elsewhere. Europe is less and less important. The war in Ukraine, which is a war in Europe, is being decided by the United States, which isn't in Europe, and Russia sitting down and talking, Russia that has declared itself and its future to be Asian. Literally, people are walking away from Europe. And pretty soon, you're going to see scientific people, artistic people leaving Europe. Europe is going to become a tourist destination, and not a whole hell of a lot more, unless they're very careful. This is staggering. This is the relative decline of Western civilization and the rise of, I don't know what we're going to call it, Eastern civilization or Global South civilization. Enormous changes that include the decline of this system, which was a product of Europe's dominance. Capitalism. Cap begins in England, that's part of Europe. It grows in Europe first. It grows in Europe the most. It enables Europe to take over the whole world and bring capitalism to the rest of the world through its colonialism. But now the rest of the world has begun to take that capitalism, develop it in new ways, and now we are all at the cusp of moving on. Capitalism will have done all it could. Again, Marx's comment, capitalism won't disappear until it has tried every possible way, every form of continuing its life. And we are seeing a range of forms: Anglo-American private capitalism, Scandinavian socialism, Soviet socialism, China socialism with the Chinese quality or its Chinese face. I think we're at the end of that, and I think that the demise of Europe is itself a symptom, a sign, an accompaniment, if you like, to the decline of capitalism. Each of them feeds on the other. Europe is committed to older capitalism. It was, it had the benefit of being there a long time. It had the benefit of its long history, but it also had the burden of its long history. It couldn't adjust fast enough. Very old story. The very capitalism it brings into being then blossoms even more elsewhere than where it was born. That happens. And it was better for European development of capitalism. That capitalism did better elsewhere than it did in Europe. It grew faster in the United States. It's then growing even faster in China, leaving the Europeans behind. Marx's theory of uneven development, there it is. And I think people should dwell on it, because there is nothing so dramatic as the decline of Europe that you see now. It is the only thing more impressive to many of us than the decline of Europe is the denial of the decline of Europe. It is amazing. One watches really minor politicians in the world picture, like Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, talking as if they were the head of the country France and England once were, but aren't anymore. You look at Britain and you see the pomp and circumstance of the coronation of King Charles. There it is. All the drama, all the pomp, all the circumstance of an empire that isn't there anymore. They just have the coach and the horses and the to-do, the simulacrum of what it once was, not the reality. And Mr. Macron, emerging from the Élysée Palace today, one begins to laugh because you're watching what is either a clown or someone mimicking a clown, or a clown so far gone he doesn't know he's a clown. And that's very funny, except for the French, who are now toying. Half of France wants to believe with him and supports him because he's the symbol. And the other half, like the rest of the world, says, go away, you are anachronistic, leftover, way out of place.
And just like that, the West's hegemony is replaced by the East's.
Yeah.
But now...
Well, no. That's very important. And the topic in itself. What comes next? There are two options. There's a choice. The Chinese could become the next empire. And Lord knows there might be a logic to it. They once had empires in China. They have some practice. They have some history. The United States, it's de nouveau here. It's all from scratch, from the beginning. But there's an alternative, and the Chinese say, for them, the future is this alternative, and it's a genuine multinationalism. Why not think that the world, might be better off without an empire, any empire, that we shouldn't replace the British with the American, with the fill in the blank. That maybe we should learn that precisely because empires go up and then go down, and the going down is painful and difficult and expensive and risky, maybe we avoid that. Maybe we take this moment of the down of the American empire and join with the Chinese. Let's try to set up a genuinely multinational operation. Let's try. We made the first effort with the League of Nations. We made the second effort with the United Nations. They were good. They were not sufficient. Maybe something can be done now when we are self-conscious enough to admit where we are. The UN wasn't created out of a sense of the decline of the British. That was not in the air. That was not spoken. The British didn't believe it. They made the UN before they lost India, etc., etc.
Is it pronounced hegemony or hegemony?
It varies. It depends on who you talk to. The one that I end up using is hegemony.
Hegemony?
But God knows, I'm no expert. It could be crazy use.
Well, we can keep this in the episode.
But hegemony, which is some of my European colleagues, you know where the term comes from, why it's used?
No.
The leader of the Italian Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci, really one of the great intellects that the communist movement in Europe ever produced. And if you're ever interested, somebody you ought to know about. He was a literary critic when he started. Long story short, got involved in the greatest wave of strikes ever to hit Italy against the Fiat automobile company, whose basic production factories were in Turin, in the north of Italy. And around I don't remember the year, 1912, 1920, somewhere in there, they had unbelievable strikes that built that union, transformed Italy. And the leader of it was this young, sort of artistic man who was remarkable because he was born in Sardinia, the island off of the coast where Corsica is. And he was born with a deformity, which in French is called bossu, in English, hunchback. You know, the bone doesn't go right. And so you're kind of twisted. Little twisted man. But he became a hero in this strike. And shortly there, and he was a member, it's very complicated Italian history. He was a member of the Socialist Party in Italy already then, as were an enormous, half the young people over 18 years old joined the Socialist Party. Mussolini was in the same party. Mussolini then quit and went to the right. Antonio Gramsci quit and went to the left. When all socialist parties split after World War I, that's when all the communist parties were created in the split. And he split for the left and became a member and joined and became the leader of the Italian Communist Party. After World War II, before World War II, the party grew very fast in Italy, really fast. And Mussolini, who went to the right, saw him as the great alternative, as the middle of Italian politics dissolved. That's why it's relevant to us now. It's the same story, for the same or very similar reasons. The middle collapsed, and the right went to Mussolini, the left went to Gramsci and the Italian Communist Party. Early in the 20s, Mussolini, to handle the situation, arrested Gramsci and put him in jail and kept him there for the rest of his life. While he was in jail, he kept notebooks on, and he remained the leader of the Communist Party in jail. The notebooks were assembled, and they are called the prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. It has been an inspiration for people, everybody on the left in the world. There's an international Gramsci society, for example, very active, headquarters in Rome. Columbia University Press published the complete prison notebooks of Gramsci. And he coined, in order to analyze Italy, he coined the phrase hegemony. And because of its centrality to his analysis of the Italian and broader European situation, it became a term that got picked up, and so that's where it comes from.
I think I first encountered the word in high school. I read a book by Noam Chomsky with hegemony in the title.
Yes.
And I didn't understand very much of that book, but I learned the word at least.
Okay. Well, if you ever want to go to the proverbial horse's mouth, Gramsci is where it comes from. And by the way, he is one of the great of the Marxian tradition. I mean, if you made a list, Marx, Engels, I don't know, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Lukács, and a few, he's right up there.
What makes Gramsci one of the greatest Marxists?
The best way to understand it is Marx himself, right? He dies in 1883. He's a philosopher. You know, he got his PhD, equivalent in Germany of a PhD, in philosophy. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Greek philosophy of, 5,000 years ago. And it's as a philosopher, he gets his first job teaching in the university. And he gets caught up, the way students today might get caught up in a pro-Palestine kind of rally or something on the campus. He got caught up in struggles of workers in the cities and towns where he was a professor. Long story short, he shifted to economics, and then he writes the rest of his life basically about economics and politics with a deep philosophic background. You know, he is one of the great students of Hegel. He comes out of the Hegelian tradition. He referred to Hegel all his life as my mentor and master. He had criticisms of his teacher, as rightly he should, but he was very angry when people denounced Hegel. He would immediately run and go, "Are you kidding? You don't understand Hegel. You don't get anything I'm doing either." A message to the left. Lenin later, who didn't understand it, late in Lenin's life, he makes a famous quote. Anyone who doesn't know, read, and study Hegel cannot understand Marx. Lenin said that because it's how he came to it. Very famous. Lenin has a whole book, very few people know it, called the Conspectus on Hegel, in which he writes an immense volume of endless notes on Hegel and how important Hegel was to Lenin's conception of revolution, of society, of social change, and all of that. Now, Hegel is a dead dog in this country. The only places that teach Hegel in any systematic way are Catholic universities, because they kept up the conventional. I wanted to be a philosopher. When I went to Harvard, I majored in philosophy. I wanted to major in philosophy, but between the horrible way it was taught and my father, who said, "I'll never get a job as a philosopher," I didn't. I went to economics, following Marx. Not that I didn't do it for that reason, but like that. Anyway, Marx writes, it's all Das Kapital. How does capitalism work? It's an economics-y focused. So much of the Marxist tradition that rises up very fast toward the end of Marx's life and really takes off after he dies, the last decades of the 19th century and then the 20th century, which is the spread of Marxism to become global, which it hadn't been before. What also happened was that as it became bigger and bigger, it attracted people whose primary interest wasn't economics, who, think of it this way. They said, "Thank you, Marx, you've helped me understand capital. Now I see how capitalism has fucked up the movies or opera or literature, or how it has shaped our culture." Gramsci is crucial because he's the first one to systematically do that. And what I mean systematically, he's sitting in jail. If my memory is right, he's arrested in 1922 and he dies in 1939. The last few months they let him out of jail. They have made him so sick in jail that he dies of... Mussolini killed him in so many words. But he's sitting there for many years, right? So he can do, written analytical work by force of prison. And so it's an enormous, and he studies, he reaches the conclusion, let me put it to you this way. If you're interested in this, in the Marxian tradition, I used to teach a course at UMass called The History of the Marxian Tradition. There was such a demand, you couldn't hold the students back from all the fields. And all I would do is say, after Marx, let me show you what happened. So Gramsci's genius was to say, and he almost used these words, "I'm jealous of Lenin." He admired Lenin. "I'm jealous of Lenin. He could make a revolution out of the chaos of Russia. We have very similar chaos here in Italy, and we couldn't do it. Why not? What? The objective situation, very similar to Russia. Devastation of war, weak capitalism, wild suffering, and a core of revolutionary. We had that in Italy, and Italy did. Why couldn't it work? Why did the revolution not happen in Italy the way it did in Russia? You know, there were revolutionary upsurges all over Europe after World War I. You know, in Bavaria, they formed something called the Bavarian Soviet Socialist Republic. They even took the name. And for a good while, Munich, the big city in the south of Germany, was the head of the revolutionary government. In Budapest, in Hungary, 2 hours away, the same thing. Georg Lukács, the great thinker, was the Minister of Education in the revolutionary Soviet Socialist Republic of Hungary. You had it in Europe. You had it in Seattle. There was a revolutionary movement in Washington. All over the world this happened. Anyway, in Italy, he asked himself the question, and he reached the following conclusion. It's the culture of Italy. It's the culture, and the way he put it, using Marxian-type language, the objective conditions for the revolution were present. The subjective conditions were not. What was in people's heads, how they understood the situation, was different here than in Russia. And what I'm going to show you, he said, is how that worked. And in order for him to do that, he had to understand the music, the religion, the family customs, and he then devotes himself to studying that. And he's a real scholar, stuck in jail. He had been a theater critic, publishing theater reviews before he got politically involved. And so it becomes the first of the great Marxists to shift over and begin to take that theoretical framework, but apply it not to economics, not even to political things. He talked about politics a lot, but that was not. The notebooks are about culture. And there, for example, you have one of the greatest analyses of the Roman Catholic Church ever. Because it's the church he grew up in. It's the Church of Italy. It's the Vatican. I mean, everything's there. So and it's very powerful among the people of Italy. It's been there for 1,000 years or more. And he wants to understand how that ended up being something that blocked a revolution otherwise about to happen from happening. And he does the same for Italian music. He does it for Italian painting. He does it for Italian family life. And so every Marxist since, and many others, have taken their clues from this extraordinary cultural analysis, how to think about these things. It's not so much the particular point he makes, but how he analyzes novels, how he analyzes newspapers in Italy. It's just extraordinary. And here in the United States, it took off in the following way, because it's America. The peculiar way this country works. I'll tell you to you this way. 20 times in my life, I have been present at some, I've been a professor all my life, so at some seminar, like at Stanford or a place like that. I went to school, I think I told you. I spent a year at Stanford as a student. And there'd be somebody giving a paper on Gramsci or comparing Gramsci to somebody else. And they would go on and go on. And I, given I'm politically active, I noticed this was Gramsci. They footnoted Gramsci. They talked about Gramsci. But they left something out. He's a communist. He's the head of the Italian Communist Party. They had to clean him out. They had to take off his feathers. They could, it's America. They could not handle that's what he was. That he was an important figure in the literature department at their seminar on postmodernism. And there's Mr. Gramsci, as he already was. But he was cleaned up. He was just Mr. Gramsci, an important Italian intellect. It's absolutely incredible. I told you, one of the people that I had time with is the Gramsci of France, which is Althusser.
Right.
Althusser is a member of the Communist Party, an activist in the Communist Party, all of his adult life. And he became the rector of something in Paris called the École Normale. That's the highest level of university you can get to. It's like, I don't know, Harvard or Yale or something, like Oxford or Cambridge. So not only is he a professor there, but he's the rector. The rector is the highest official. It's like, we don't have that here, but I don't know, provost or chancellor or some hoity-toity president of the university is an active communist, public active and this is in the 1970s and 80s. Can you imagine here in the United States? I would talk about Althusser. People who know a little bit, they know who that is. He's widely published, and he is the rector at École Normale. Means you're France's #1 philosopher. That officially, that's what you are. But here in America, they knew who he was, but that he was a communist, they didn't know. When I would tell them that, they would look at me. They would look at me as if somebody they really admired turned out to have a flatulence problem. They didn't know what to do with the. Very strange. It's very strange about our culture. In Europe, everybody knows. To be a communist or a socialist in Europe is no big deal. Every country has Communist Party, Socialist Party. Everybody's family has Uncle Harry or Aunt Louise who's in the party. And so when they have a family picnic, they have arguments, and nobody's frightened by this. But not here. Here, because you've repressed it, you can then tell stories about it, right. And they can become monsters, because who's to refute it? Nobody. So, anyway. That's where hegemony comes from. And Gramsci is the key man.